We're now in server 01, basically the same as before, but we're adding in some more queries. And to refresh our memory, we can see that in our schema, when we use the query in the playground, it looks to see which object has all the query definitions, sees it's something called query here, looks in here, finds query, and then can resolve them all. So let's open up the playground. And currently we'll probably just see the very first and only one that's active at the moment, which is hello. We've seen that before. So here again we see query. When we call it and open it up, it looks inside the schema, finds the query reference, and can then, when we do space tab, sees that we've got one. We can do hello and we get back hello. So now what we'll do, for example, is how do we pass in variables? And to remind ourselves that we can have a definition in the query but not in the resolvers, and GraphQL doesn't throw an error. It's fine to say we've defined something in the query, but if we come back here and put in a resolver, which is here, without it being in the schema, it crashes because it says you've sent me a resolver but I don't know how to apply it. So that's the difference between the two. So if we come back here, put that one in here and uncomment it, and if you notice, we've got bracket, we're saying it gets passed an argument x, and it must not be null, so we must supply something, and it's going to be of type int. So when we come into here, when we see it, if we come up into here and run test, let's do that, refresh here so we get the latest, come back in, we see test. If we do this, it says there's an error, you must supply an argument. That's because we made it mandatory up here. Let's uncomment that and just say it's optional. Come back in here and refresh, do it again, and it comes back, and in the resolver we get an error nan, because when we look at the resolver function of what's actually involved, it goes into test and it returns back args.x. So whenever we have a query, we get four things supplied: the parent object, which we'll get to later, any arguments, which we have here, context, we'll speak about later, and info. So args contains the parameter passed in, and in this case it's x. So basically, if we don't pass anything, this will be undefined, hence we get nan. So let's go back here and then put in, and we can see it highlights x. It's already sensed, it knows there's an input. Let's put in 3, send that back, and we're getting a random number. In this example, math random of 3 times math random, so it goes up 1 to 4. So if we do this again, refresh, and it's adding. So it's adding this formula, it's taking 3 plus a random number between 3 and 0. So that's how we can pass in input values and whether they're defined and what it returns. Now this is returning a string. Let's just say it had to return an integer. What would happen? If we're telling GraphQL everything's fine so far, but if we come in here and refresh and send that, int cannot be represented by a non-integer value. It's expressing an int, but it can't because we're sending back a string. So therefore it's checking its types. So we can go back Z, so long as it's a string, and we have to send something back. It can't be null. So if we went into our query and returned null here, for example, if we return null, it would throw an error. Because it's in the definition, cannot return a null. So we begin to see how all these things pan out. So that's test. We can do the same with getNum, but now we can move on to something called lists. And lists are basically arrays, and we have different ways of defining them. So let's open up this list here. It's in the query, and if we come down, that's in the query. We must also define something up here, otherwise it's going to crash. So let's just say that it returns a list, and let's take this first one. And this says list can return null. And inside there it may contain a string, but it may not, but it may also have null inside, and that's different to it being empty. So if we come in here let's go back into here, let's refresh, let's look at the docs. We see we have list, a scalar string, it's a list with a scalar string inside. So let's just run list here, see what we get. It gets A. Let's have a look at what's in the resolver, and we can see it's returning something of type A. If it returns nothing inside, an empty array, refresh, that's okay. What if it doesn't return anything? Can it return null? Refresh, it can. The reason being because we defined it here. So if we comment this one out and put this one in here and say, you know what, it must return a list of some sort, and if it has a list it may contain a string in type. If we come in here, refresh again, error, it can't be null. We've defined it as not being null, which we've seen before, so we must return something. So if we come into list and we'll return an empty list is fine. That's okay. Inside we've said it contain a string. Let's make that mandatory. It must, if it's got to contain something, it must contain a string. Now notice when we say here, we're not saying that there has to be a string. We're after saying it has to be not null, and it's going to be of string type, and if it's not, it's going to be of a string type. So if we refresh this, refresh up here, that's fine. It returns a list. It can be an empty list, that is fine, that is satisfied here. But if we return, should we say with 3 inside as opposed to a string, what happens? Refresh, that's fine, and this is because of loose coercion. So for example here there is something up at the top which we'll get into, but there is still loose coercion of different types. But what happens if we say put in something that's can't be really coerced, an object? Come in here, refresh, cannot represent, so therefore the shape is an object as opposed to a scalar. No coercion can take place, so it's an error. So that's a little subtle point, that basically strings and false, even if we put in here false, a boolean, and we're expecting, if it can't be null but it looks like it should be a string and only a string, if we put this in here and refresh, we'll probably see coercion again. It's being coerced into a string type. So the takeaway from this is the main shape, scalar types do get coerced, but if it's an object or something else that's not of this type, coercion can't take place. So let's comment out all of these. Come up here and comment these out. So we've seen lists, and if we look in our guide, we can see that when we come down here, we have some notes, and we also have null abilities in list reference. If it appears inside the square brackets, the return list can't include items that are null. If it's outside the list itself, can't be null, but it's valid for the list to be empty. And we have a little picture here that kind of shows us from the docs exactly what that will do. And it's, remember that it's not really doing, it's because it's coercing, it's only scalars and objects that it differentiates between. So coming back to Server01, what we can see here is, if we see in this very first one here, REST API ID must optional integer. Let's make that mandatory, and it's going to return a string. If we come down into the resolver, we can see REST API is basically making an async request to random user API, getting the very first element. In fact, what we'll do is we'll make this optional, because we're not really putting it in the API at the moment, and returning the first name. So if we now come to here, what we can see is if we take that out, do that, we get REST API. Do this, we get the first name back from random user. So what we can see in this example is that basically how GraphQL can be a wrapper around our existing APIs and basically taking it. Now let's put in here / args, and it gives us an ID, and we can see that in the console here. Let's see what that happens. So now what we want is, if we come back here into the refresh, expected token n in position 0. Let's now firstly define our ID. See, it's picked up that we have an ID. Let's pick up 1, pass it through. Unexpected token. Let's just see what's wrong with this. $args ID. Let's open up this and go back here. It's not getting the right args. So if we do API 1, right, so it's the API call that's wrong there. That's coming back. So we can see here, if we come down here and we pass in an argument, let's pass in an argument, come back here, we're passing an ID 1. We're not, let's refresh. Let's take this out. Come back here and see what have we done wrong. -API, that should all, let's save that. We can see 1 being logged out here. So we can see our parameter, args ID. Let's put in here. So we come back here, load this, put in ID 1, invalid response to token position line 2 column 3, ID 1. What are we doing wrong here? Let's come back here, let's close everything, let's discard all the changes because they were working before. Let's open up this one here, let's come back up here, let's comment this out, let's come back up top and put in this one here, optional API, come back in here, send that, there we go, we're getting it. And if we look at our things, we can see we're getting 1, and we're getting the console log of Janik and first name. So if we look in our resolver at the bottom here, we're console logging the args ID. So we just say args.id, move that across. So we're getting that, and we're console logging the name and the first name, returning the first name for this API. We can send in a parameter if we were constructing an API with that parameter. But if we come back here, refresh, as we've changed this, let's change this to 3, different name, and basically what we could do is change this value in here because we're getting back a number of users. If we click on this and have a look, we're getting 1 user back, so it's picking up the very first one there. So we can see how that GraphQL can be a wrapper around existing REST APIs. Now we can also define more complex shapes. At the moment we've just been sending back scalar types. But what if, for example, here in the me API, we basically, showing all these things up here, we say we have a query called me that returns me. And of course now GraphQL says, well, what is me? This is why this is not working here. So we can define our own object types. And if we put this one here, it now says, okay, me is this type of object and its ID. Notice it's at root level. It's like at the root level of the query. It's its own kind of object type, and it has an ID. It must have an ID, and an ID is basically a number or string. It gets serialized, and it's more declarative to say this is important. So ID could be int or it could be string, but by giving it ID, it just signifies to the client that this is of special importance, and the stack that they use is string. So if we save this, come back down, query.rest API defined in resolvers but not schema. Well, we told GraphQL query this is a resolver, but it can't see it anywhere in its definition, so of course it throws an error. So if we comment that back out, everything works fine here. Let's open up and close all the others and refresh, and we'll clear away, and let's see what we've got here. If we look at our docs now, we see we've got a query called me, and it returns something back me which has an ID and a string. So if we type in me, if we just do this, this is not sufficient for GraphQL because it's saying it's got to have a selection of subfields, because me, it doesn't know what, it must return certain types of fields, and we must tell it what fields to send back. So we prettify, And if we come in here, we can see we've got ID and stack. We don't have to send all back, but that we've got to send back something. Let's prettify, and that means it's probably working now. If we send that back, me null. And why is that back? It's defined as null. Well, that will be because of our resolvers, and in our resolvers we've got nothing. It's just null. And so GraphQL defaults to null, so it doesn't throw up errors higher up in the chain. So if we come back down here and just do this, and we're going to send back, and it's got to be of type me, and me must have an ID and must have a stack. So when it's sending things back, it's sending this back. This is in the right shape. So if we come back here and refresh, so it's got the resolvers, me ID JS1. Now if we send something back that's not an object, if we comment this out and send back instead string, refresh, we'll get an error because it can't return null. It doesn't know what these ID, and we're asking for ID and stack, and it can't provide them because we haven't supplied it in the resolver an object. So although it's actually happy to have this as an incorrect resolver, in a sense it's returning the wrong type, when we run the query on the client side, errors will occur. So if we take this back out and return the right shape, it's an object with an ID and a stack. It's an object with an ID and a stack. If we send that back, refresh, we're not asking for anything back, so let's put in this. We could just send ID back, that's fine because we request client data. Let's put in stack. There we go. Now if we come back here, and what happens if we don't supply back a stack? What's going to happen? Well, the query seems fine, the resolver, but when we come back here, notice when we resolve it, it's got to have an ID and it's got to have a stack. That's what we're saying the object will have. So we send this back, cannot return null. And if we take this out, and so to avoid the problem and do it again, we can get it because we're not asking for stack. But once we ask for the stack and the query is run, GraphQL will throw an error because there's a mismatch between the resolver, what the resolver is sending back, and what it's expecting. So if we put that back in, come in here, refresh, and run it, all is happy. And of course what we can do here is, if we wanted to, we can do the first name. So for example, we can comment this one out here, and we can send in this that's expecting necessarily an ID. And what we can do is we can come back, comment this one out, and send in, create a different one. This is optional. So if there is a first name, it'll probably be of type string, but we don't have to supply an input. So if we come back here into our, and now run a new query, if we come back here and type in me, brackets, you can see it says you could have a first name or not. What happens if we don't send anything back? Prettify. It's expecting at least this ID here, so let's do that. Let's put that in here. And it can be, see if it can be null. No. If we send back, put in null. Actually it's first name. Click on this, it's first name. And if we say null, doesn't like that, but if we put in a first name, it's of type string, and it must be in quotes, double quotes, first name Craig. That's because it's expecting some fields back. So let's go back and do this once again. Put that in here. Let's send in no parameter, but let's remove that out. Let's start from scratch. query me, and put in an open. What does this send back? Nothing. Me first name string, because when we come back to our resolver, it's going to send back id1 stack if it's okay. args.firstname. This is now kind of expecting it some sort of input, so let's put that there. First name, quotes, Craig, bracket, expecting an ID, and it's expecting a stack. So if we're doing everything as specified, ID Craig's main stack is JS. If we remove this out, nope, do this. So we can send back that with no undefined main skill is JS, but once we put in our bracket here, it's expecting something. So if we refresh, that's not doing anything there. If we refresh the page there, we can see nothing's happening. But if it is in here, it's expecting a first name. Could be null. Let's run this. Null's main skill is JS. We've allowed nulls. If we come back into the definition up top here and say we must supply, it can't be null. So if we come in here and run this again, having changed the query, we get an error, found null. Let's put in a number, 4, and see what happens. Expected type string found 4 instead. So obviously it's expecting that right type of parameter. We could put in 4 here as a string. 4's main skill is JS. So this is how we can supply input parameters to our queries. And remember, when we have our list now with our REST API, we can see, because when we're in here, we can see we're getting the args ID, we're getting the value that we're sending through by console logging out the args.firstname, and first name was defined as an input parameter. So this is an example of using lists, how we can make a thin wrapper for REST APIs, and we've started in our queries to send through variables so we can customize our queries.